The Watch Dogs series is one that's seen plenty of ups and downs since its initial debut in 2014. The first game suffered from a bland protagonist and visuals that didn't live up to the hype, while its gunplay and hacking mechanics were genuinely fun to use. Conversely, Watch Dogs 2 featured a much more likable cast and visually appealing world, but it was jarring to use the original's solid shooting mechanics with a much less edgy hero. Now, with Watch Dogs Legion, the series has received its biggest overhaul yet, doing away with the concept of a single defined protagonist in favor of a city's worth of procedurally generated operatives. The result is a game that initially has a lot of promise, but ultimately runs out of tricks far too early. Quick disclaimer, this review features footage captured specifically from a PlayStation 4 Pro. Watch Dogs Legion takes place in a near-future London that's been thrown into disarray following a citywide terrorist attack, an event meant to frame the vigilante hackers known as DedSec while simultaneously seeing them wiped out by the real perpetrators. In the aftermath, a private military company has assumed control of law and order within the city, while London's criminal underworld have combined to form a singular organization. The game picks up a few months later and puts you in control of the entire city of London. The few surviving members of DedSec have begun recruiting from the population at large, and while that makes for a unique gameplay gimmick, this element doesn't make for great storytelling, at least in the traditional sense. The procedurally generated elements have a lot of emergent storytelling potential, but without a clearly defined protagonist, I found it hard to get invested in the actual story, and it doesn't help that Legion's most likable supporting character is its snarky AI companion, who isn't even all that likable. Now, to its credit, Watch Dogs Legion does have a variety of subplots that go in some interesting directions, but the overall dark tone of the game can't help but feel cheapened somewhat by its writing. The game constantly flits between feeling really grim and kind of goofy thanks to a constant stream of cheerful banter between the characters being set against some truly horrific plot points. The weird tonal issues of Watch Dogs Legion aren't helped at all by the voice work, which is serviceable for the main cast of named characters, but just does not hold up at all with the game's approach to playable characters. In fairness, making every NPC a potential player character is a massive undertaking, but it didn't take long for me to come across characters who sounded exactly the same as each other, and it took even less time to find characters with voices that were simply pitch shifted to sound slightly different. On top of that, all of the potential player characters pull from a small but wildly varied pool of accents, and while I'm sure some of these are fairly accurate, a lot of them are cartoonishly over the top. Backing up the disappointingly small set of voices is a procedural character creation algorithm whose results feel pretty lackluster. Again, it doesn't take long before you start finding characters who look like someone you've already recruited, just with different hair or a slightly different skin tone. That isn't to say that these characters look bad per se, it's just really underwhelming that the main selling point of the game is executed in such a noticeably cobbled together fashion. Beyond Legion's recruits, the game actually looks fairly good, if not particularly noteworthy. It feels like a solid representation of near-future London, complete with hologram augments on tourist attractions and militarized law enforcement stationed at every other street corner, and on the PS4, the game runs fairly well, though the frame rate does drop a little in larger, more busy areas. Also, the game is home to some Assassin's Creed Unity-style bugs, if you know what I mean. It is also worth pointing out that Watch Dogs Legion is a cross-generation game, and though I can't speak to its quality on Microsoft's line of consoles, the game does benefit from faster load times, a smoother frame rate, and some fairly impressive ray tracing on the PS5 version of the game. Those faster load times in particular are a surprisingly big deal because you'll be loading in and out a bunch if you're using Watch Dogs Legion's biggest new feature to its fullest. While the majority of the game is pretty similar to its predecessors, as an open-world game with stealth, combat, and driving mechanics, it sets itself apart from them with its recruitment system. Instead of playing as a dedicated hacker, you're now able to play as a wide range of characters that you just recruit off the streets. Construction workers, hospital staff, software developers, anyone you come across you can potentially recruit to the cause. On top of the surface-level differences between recruits, each character also has access to their own unique benefits, from simple gear such as cars and guns, to traits like improved hacking or the ability to recover your injured or imprisoned operatives faster. There are also negative traits such as low mobility or flatulence that can alert guards to your presence, but more often than not I found characters with only negative traits and nothing to really encourage you to recruit them. This all seems pretty interesting from the outset, but you quickly realize that there are really only a couple of recruits worth looking for. Hackers, with their increased key stealing range and quicker downloads, are a no-brainer, and it's helpful to have a professional hitman on hand for more combat-focused missions. The most interesting aspects of the recruitment system are definitely the more subtle details at its core. Every potential player character has their own traits and equipment, sure, but they also have a daily schedule and known associates, both of which can be manipulated in order to change how potential recruits feel about you. Let's say, hypothetically, you accidentally run over a character's nephew on your way to recruit them. Guess who won't want anything to do with DedSec? Unfortunately, that's about as extensive as the recruitment system gets. It's definitely fun to mess around with, and seeing these characters go about their daily business is pretty impressive, but considering how heavily Legion leans on this system, there just isn't enough here to really sink your teeth into for the duration of the game. Beyond that taste of something really cool and unique, Watch Dogs Legion is a lot more of the same, but with a handful of changes that are honestly kind of baffling. First and foremost are the sneaking and hacking mechanics, since the majority of the game's missions task you with infiltrating enemy territory and hacking certain devices, whether in person or remotely. For the most part, hacking is as fast and intuitive as it was previously, with quick hacks and further hacking options mapped to button taps and holds respectively. Strangely, the scale of your hacks seems to have been stripped back a little. While you can still hack enemy drones, cameras, security systems, and vehicles, among other things, larger scale hacks such as traffic light malfunctions, faction war manipulation, and citywide blackouts are nowhere to be found. Considering that the elite hacker power fantasy is the main reason this franchise exists, paring these skills back at all feels counterintuitive to me. The stealth mechanics, on the other hand, feel relatively unchanged since Watch Dogs 2. You're still given a decent amount of leeway between the time an enemy spots you and the time they alert their friends, and if you're fast enough, you can totally stun an enemy and take them out with a super satisfying takedown before they call for backup. It isn't a perfect stealth system, however, as I did find that enemies would unnaturally gravitate towards my current hiding spot even if I had managed to escape from my last known location completely unnoticed. While I do feel like the hacking and stealth have regressed a bit since Watch Dogs 2, Legion is still at its absolute best when you're sneaking through enemy territory and hacking their stuff without being noticed. To that end, I have to say that the game's level design, when it comes to enemy bases at least, is surprisingly open and encourages plenty of chances for exploration and infiltration, whether that involves climbing up pipes, riding construction drones to reach rooftops, or using spider bots or hacked cameras to proceed without risking your character at all. On that note, the game provides plenty of tech options and hack upgrades to expand the variety of ways you can approach a situation, but in all honesty, I found that I really only used the AR stealth cloak and the spider bot, with the latter of the two making most stealth sections far too easy and thus kind of boring. If sneaky stealth isn't your style, you could always go in guns blazing, but not only does Watch Dogs Legion suffer from the same tonal issues as its predecessor, where whipping out a gun just seems wildly out of character for most operatives, whether lethal or not, it also doesn't feel very satisfying or effective. Most enemies can tank a few rounds to the face before they go down, and it feels like no one reacts to being shot anywhere else half as badly as they probably should. This is obviously not great, but if you could stealth through the entire game and never worry about being put into a firefight, I'd be able to give this one aspect of Legion a pass. However, in its final third, the game throws you into a series of missions that funnel you into unavoidable gunfights, and unless you've brought a combat-focused character, you are in for a miserable time. On more than one occasion, I found myself walking into missions with characters I was quite attached to without realizing that they would be so combat heavy, and this almost always resulted in that character being killed permanently. As frustrating as these instances were, I would still recommend playing with permadeath enabled, as the game lacks a lot of tension without it. Knowing that your operatives could be removed from the game entirely at any given moment actually raises the stakes substantially, especially if you've looked into their procedurally generated bios and come up with your own headcanon for them. Otherwise, being incapacitated results in a hospital visit or a stay in jail, and these boil down to cooldown timers for when your characters will be available again, which is ultimately pretty meaningless, especially when you can have 45 recruits at any given time. Rounding out the open world experience that Watch Dogs Legion brings to the table are driving and melee mechanics that are functional but not particularly interesting. The driving can be fast and mildly entertaining, and the in-game radio features a decent range of music, but it genuinely felt like I could count London's range of cars on both hands, and most cars felt a little stiff to control. Meanwhile, the melee boils down to pretty mindless button mashing for attacks, guard breaks, and counters, but it winds up feeling clumsy thanks to enemies who can just power through your attacks without actually countering you first. The game is also kind of underwhelming in terms of its side content, as the bare-knuckle fights, kick-up minigames, and repetitive hacktivist side quests wear thin really quickly. This is especially true for the hacktivist missions, as they often reuse hostile areas from the recruitment missions, which in turn utilize many of the same areas as the game's core missions. By the time I hit the game's credits, I could only remember a handful of story missions because the rest of Watch Dogs Legion's content just blurred together into an endless mishmash of sneaking, executing takedowns, and hacking stuff. With all that said, Watch Dogs Legion is mediocre. Combining solid stealth and hacking options with level design that encourages multiple paths through most hostile zones, Watch Dogs Legion does offer a certain level of enjoyment, but its main draw, the recruitment system, just isn't fleshed out enough to elevate the rest of the repetitive Ubisoft open world fare. Add to that a final third that forces you into gameplay sequences that the game just does not excel at, and Watch Dogs Legion has left a really bad taste in my mouth. If you're super invested in the Watch Dogs franchise, you might get something out of this, but otherwise I would recommend waiting for it to be heavily discounted before checking it out, if at all. Watch Dogs Legion is out on PC, PS4, Xbox One, the Xbox Series X and S, and the PlayStation 5. Fuck me, that is too many platforms.